The most lethal battlefield of the Vietnam War was not the dense jungle of the Mekong Delta or the misty highlands of Khe Sanh. It was a quiet, tree-lined university campus in Ohio, a television studio in New York City, and the pavement of Pennsylvania Avenue, directly outside the gates of the White House. In these domestic spaces, without firing a single conventional weapon, an unarmed army of ordinary citizens managed to do what the North Vietnamese military could never achieve on its own. They broke the political spine of the world's sole superpower. How did a nation that stood so resolutely united against global fascism just 2 decades earlier find itself fighting a bitter war on 2 fronts? One, against a resilient guerrilla adversary abroad, and an even more formidable one against its own children at home? This is the story of how the American home front did not just protest a war, it actively dismantled the political will to fight it, proving that in modern conflict, the living room can be more decisive than the battlefield. To understand this extraordinary collapse of domestic consensus, we must look beyond the sterile statistics of body counts and bomb tonnage. We must look at the faces of the millions of ordinary Americans who decided that their government had led them into a moral and strategic abyss. The divide was not merely political, it was generational, cultural, and deeply personal, tearing families apart at dinner tables and pitting classmates against each other. For the first time in human history, the technology of television brought the raw, unedited horror of combat directly into suburban homes. Every evening, as families gathered for dinner, the nightly news broadcasted the grim reality of bloodied soldiers, burning villages, and zippered body bags. This constant stream of graphic imagery created a profound psychological disconnect between the optimistic press releases issued by the Pentagon and the harrowing reality visible on the screen. The government insisted that victory was just around the corner, that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, but the public could see with their own eyes that the tunnel was collapsing. This friction between official narrative and visual reality birthed what became known as the credibility gap, a chasm of distrust that would permanently alter the relationship between the American citizen and the state. As we trace this journey, we find ourselves asking a fundamental question: can a democracy successfully wage a long, protracted war of attrition abroad when it loses the moral consent of its people at home? The answer would not be found in the military command centers of Saigon, but in the streets of Washington, Chicago, and Kent State. To fully comprehend how this domestic explosion occurred, we must travel back to the early years of the Cold War, when a powerful consensus dominated American political life. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the United States was gripped by an intense, existential fear of global communist expansion. Under the influence of the domino theory, policymakers in Washington believed that if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, neighboring countries would inevitably fall, like a row of dominoes. This geopolitical doctrine transformed a localized, anti-colonial struggle in Vietnam into a vital national security interest for the United States. When President Lyndon B. Johnson used the highly disputed Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 to secure a near-unanimous congressional resolution, he was granted a blank check to wage war without a formal declaration. At first, the American public largely supported this intervention, trusting their leaders to contain the communist threat. However, as the American military footprint rapidly expanded from a few thousand advisors to more than 500,000 combat troops, the human cost of the war began to hit home with devastating frequency. The engine driving this massive escalation was the selective service system, commonly known as the draft. Unlike the broad national mobilization of World War II, which was widely seen as an existential struggle for survival, the Vietnam-era draft was deeply unequal. It contained numerous loopholes, exemptions, and deferments that allowed wealthy and middle-class young men, particularly those enrolled in college, to avoid military service entirely. Consequently, the burden of fighting and dying in the jungles of Vietnam fell disproportionately on working-class, rural, and minority communities. This systemic inequality sowed the seeds of deep resentment across the nation. Young men who were not even old enough to vote as the voting age was 21 at the time, were being forced to risk their lives for a conflict whose strategic objectives remained vague, shifting, and poorly explained. The early anti-war movement was small, led primarily by traditional pacifist organizations, religious groups, and radical student organizations, like the Students for a Democratic Society. They staged modest rallies, organized teach-ins on college campuses, and published pamphlets questioning the morality of the intervention. But as the draft calls grew larger and the casualties mounted, these isolated voices of dissent began to coalesce into a massive, national movement that crossed socioeconomic lines. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the state and its youth, a clash that would challenge the very foundations of American democracy. The year 1968 shattered any remaining illusions of a swift and decisive American victory. In late January, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday of Tet, Communist forces launched a massive, coordinated surprise offensive against more than 100 cities and military installations across South Vietnam. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a severe tactical defeat for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, who suffered devastating casualties and failed to spark a popular uprising. However, strategically and psychologically, it was a catastrophic blow to the American war effort. For months, General William Westmoreland and administration officials had assured the public that the enemy was exhausted and that the end of the conflict was in sight. The sheer scale and audacity of the Tet Offensive exposed these claims as complete fabrications. The American public watched in utter shock as news cameras captured intense fighting inside the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, a symbol of American power and security. The psychological turning point was perhaps best embodied by Walter Cronkite, the highly respected anchor of CBS Evening News, who traveled to Vietnam to assess the situation firsthand. Upon his return, Cronkite delivered a rare personal commentary, concluding that the United States was mired in a bloody stalemate and that negotiation was the only rational way out. President Johnson reportedly remarked that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. The political fallout was immediate and profound. In March 1968, a deeply shaken Johnson announced to a stunned nation that he would not seek re-election, acknowledging that his presidency had been consumed by the division over the war. The anti-war movement, energized and vindicated, took to the streets with renewed urgency. It was no longer just student radicals protesting. The movement was joined by prominent civil rights leaders, most notably Martin Luther King Jr., who eloquently linked the struggle for racial justice at home with the destruction of poor communities in Vietnam. The summer of 1968 became a crucible of American unrest. The assassination of King in April and Robert F. Kennedy in June stripped the nation of its most powerful voices of hope and reconciliation. When the Democratic National Convention convened in Chicago that August, thousands of anti-war protesters gathered to demand an immediate end to the conflict. The resulting clash between demonstrators and the Chicago Police Department was broadcast live to millions of viewers, revealing a nation seemingly tearing itself apart from within. This public display of political violence and division signaled to the world that the domestic consensus supporting the war had completely evaporated. In 1969, Richard Nixon assumed the presidency, promising to bring peace with honor to the divided nation. He introduced a strategy known as Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually withdraw American ground forces while training and equipping the South Vietnamese military to take over the fighting. This policy initially succeeded in quietening some domestic dissent as draft calls began to decline. However, the fragile peace at home was violently shattered in the spring of 1970. In late April, Nixon announced that American and South Vietnamese forces had launched a major military incursion into neighboring Cambodia to destroy communist supply lines and sanctuaries. To a public that had been promised a steady de-escalation of the conflict, this sudden expansion of the war felt like a profound betrayal. College campuses across the nation erupted in immediate, furious protest. At Kent State University in Ohio, several days of tense demonstrations culminated on the 4th of May, 1970. The Ohio National Guard was deployed to the campus to maintain order. In a moment of extreme tension, a group of guardsmen suddenly turned and fired live ammunition into a crowd of unarmed student protesters and bystanders. In a matter of 13 seconds, 4 students were killed and 9 others were wounded. The iconic photograph of a young woman screaming in agony over the body of a slain student became an instant symbol of a nation at war with its own children. The shockwave from the Kent State shootings was unprecedented. A national student strike was declared, shutting down more than 400 colleges and universities as millions of students refused to attend classes. The tragedy was compounded just 10 days later when state police opened fire at Jackson State College, a historically black institution in Mississippi, killing 2 students and wounding 12 others. The nation was on the brink of a systemic crisis. The moral authority of the government had reached its lowest ebb. This crisis of confidence deepened further in June 1971, when the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers. This classified Department of Defense study, leaked by military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, revealed that successive administrations had systematically lied to Congress and the public about the true scope, progress, and objectives of the war. The ultimate truth was now public. The government had known for years that the war was likely unwinnable, yet they had continued to send young Americans to their deaths to avoid the political humiliation of defeat. This revelation shattered any remaining trust in the executive branch, marking the ultimate climax of the domestic crisis. The revelation of the Pentagon Papers and the tragedies of 1970 permanently altered the character of the anti-war movement. It was no longer a movement defined solely by youthful rebellion or countercultural idealism. It had penetrated the very institutions of American power, including the military itself. One of the most powerful and poignant developments of this period was the rise of the Vietnam veterans against the war. In April 1971, over 1,000 decorated veterans, many in wheelchairs or on crutches, gathered in Washington, D.C., for a demonstration called Dewey Canyon III. In a deeply symbolic and emotional ceremony, these men marched to the steps of the United States Capitol and threw their Purple Hearts, bronze stars, and military medals over a wire fence, rejecting the war they had been sent to fight. Earlier that year, the veterans had organized the Winter Soldier Investigation, where dozens of former servicemen gave public testimony about the systemic atrocities and daily horrors they had witnessed or participated in during their tours of duty. This was not enemy propaganda. These were the testimonies of American soldiers who had served on the front lines. Within the military ranks in Vietnam, discipline and morale were rapidly disintegrating. Underground GI newspapers circulated widely. Soldiers wore peace symbols on their helmets, and some units actively refused orders to engage in combat. The phenomenon of fragging, the deliberate targeting of unpopular or overly aggressive officers by their own troops using fragmentation grenades, became a terrifying reality. The military leadership realized that they could no longer rely on a conscript army to fight an unpopular war of indefinite duration. Faced with a collapsing military structure and overwhelming domestic pressure, the Nixon administration hastened the pace of American withdrawal. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, officially ended direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. While the agreement allowed for the return of American prisoners of war and the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. troops, it did not resolve the underlying conflict between North and South Vietnam. It merely allowed the United States to extricate itself from a quagmire that had torn its society apart, leaving the Vietnamese to decide the fate of their own country in a war that would continue for 2 more bloody years, eventually culminating in the fall of Saigon in 1975. The legacy of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era remains one of the most significant chapters in modern political history. It demonstrated that in a democratic society, the ultimate power of a nation does not reside solely in its military technology or its economic wealth, but in the collective will and moral consent of its citizens. The movement successfully challenged the concept of the imperial presidency, forcing a fundamental reassessment of executive power and foreign policy decision-making. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution over President Nixon's veto, requiring the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing military forces to hostile situations and strictly limiting their deployment without formal congressional approval. This legislative check was a direct response to the unchecked executive overreach that had led to the escalation of the Vietnam War. Furthermore, the conflict permanently altered the relationship between the American public, the media, and the state. The era of unquestioning trust in government pronouncements was gone forever, replaced by a healthy, if sometimes cynical, skepticism that persists to this day. The anti-war movement also forced a structural transformation of the military itself, leading to the complete abolition of the draft in 1973 and the transition to an all-volunteer force. This monumental shift was designed to ensure that future military actions would be carried out by professional soldiers who had chosen to serve, rather than conscripts forced into battle against their will. For decades after the fall of Saigon, American foreign policy was haunted by what policymakers called the Vietnam syndrome, a deep public reluctance to intervene in foreign conflicts without a clear, limited national interest, a defined exit strategy, and strong public support. The movement proved that a nation cannot successfully wage a long-term war abroad if it fails to maintain a stable, democratic consensus at home. It showed that dissent is not an act of disloyalty, but a vital democratic mechanism for holding leaders accountable to the values they claim to defend. Beyond policy and law, the movement permanently fractured the American cultural landscape, creating a deep partisan divide over patriotism and national identity that continues to echo in modern political discourse, proving that the scars of the domestic front run just as deep as those of the battlefield. As we look back at this turbulent era from the vantage point of the 21st century, the lessons of the Vietnam anti-war movement feel more relevant than ever. Today, in an age of instant communication, social media, and decentralized information, the battle for public opinion remains a central dimension of any modern conflict. The battlefield is no longer just a physical space. It is a complex narrative space where perceptions are shaped, challenged, and contested in real time by actors across the globe. The power to wage war still depends, as it did in the 1960s, on the silent consent or active support of the population. This history invites us to reflect on our own role as citizens in a globalized world. How do we distinguish between official narratives and objective reality when the stakes are so high? How do we balance the demands of national security with the imperative of moral responsibility? These are not merely historical questions. They are urgent contemporary challenges that every democratic society must confront. We want to hear your thoughts on this deeply complex chapter of history. Do you think the anti-war movement was a necessary corrective that saved American democracy from its own worst impulses, or did it ultimately undermine a vital strategic effort and abandon an ally in need? How should a democracy handle deep ideological divisions during times of international crisis? Let us know in the comments section below. We look forward to reading your respectful and insightful discussions. If you found this deep dive into the history of the home front valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with others who appreciate nuanced, historically accurate storytelling. Your engagement is what allows us to keep producing high-quality, research-driven content that explores the complex forces that have shaped our modern world. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode as we continue to explore the untold stories of our shared past.